Good afternoon. I'm Eleanor Slumba, President of ArtsWestCT, a young public-facing art service organization here in West Haven. And on behalf of the Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to this event. It is a special occasion, but we hope things like this will become more of a regular occurrence as we gather around an art form that has nourished us, sustained us, in many cases informed our histories and complex identities, and even helped us understand the deepest parts of who we are as a person. We have folks from all different backgrounds coming together today, including poetry students, young practitioners, poetry elders, and those using it in different kinds of educational and community engagement practices. And that's very exciting. Our own Poet Laureate, Tony Fusco, couldn't be here today, but he also welcomes you. He invited an organization that he's involved with, Connecticut Poetry Society, into this conversation, and we'll make sure that today is just the start of more and more dialogue. Antoinette is a woman, Brim-Bell, a woman of many accomplishments and the newly appointed 8th Poet Laureate for the state of Connecticut. She is also a West Haven resident, and as such, we wanted to know her vision in her new role. And it was to host a convening like this to amplify the theme that she's chosen for her tenure, collaboration and connection. So thank you for being a part of it. And if you're just getting newly plugged in to ArtsWestCT activities, please make sure we have your mailing list to keep in touch with you about other events like this in the future. Just the obligatory housekeeping note about turning your phones off so that we can enjoy the atmosphere. And as this panel concludes, we will have a Q&A portion, so stick around for that. And thanks to our funders, Connecticut Humanities, the Sustainable CT Local Matching Fund, and the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, our fiscal sponsor. We have students from the University of New Haven's Department of Communications, Film, and Media Studies here today helping out, and we're very glad about that. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Antoinette Brim-Bell. Help me welcome the panel.
Wow, thank you so much for being here on this very cold and beautiful fall day. And wow, is not this high school campus absolutely beautiful? This auditorium is amazing. Yeah, I'll give a big round of applause for that. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to begin my tenure as Connecticut State Poet Laureate here at West Haven High School, where 2 of my children graduated. I am a proud Westie. First, I want to begin by thanking the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, Sustainable CT, CT Humanities, and the CT Office of the Arts. Thank you to Frederick-Douglass Knowles, Joan Kwon Glass, Natasha Gambrell, and Dr. Jose Gonzalez for sitting on our upcoming panel. And thank you to Ife-Michelle Gardin for serving as our panel moderator. A very special thanks goes to Eleanor Slumba of ArtsWestCT, whose arts engagement expertise has brought all of this to fruition. Our theme, Poets Are Not a Luxury, is of course derived from Audre Lorde's seminal 1985 essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. This essay only seems to grow in relevance Poetry, as Lord describes it, is a vital necessity for our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hope and dreams toward survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Art, and in our case, poetry, offers the opportunity to explore and subsequently expound upon the challenges of our times. This allows individuals to find a means of sharing experiences. Lord continues, poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest external horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. I suggest to you that in between lines and stanza breaks and the tumble into enjambment, readers and writers find common experience, common ideas, and in that common space, the beginning of conversations that lead to connection and collaboration. Today, when our country is divided and civil discourse seems no longer fashionable, poetry is a necessity. As Lord says, where language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps to fashion it. Poetry is not only a dream or vision, it is skeleton architecture of our lives. Thank you.
And in that spirit, we will start with art, recognizing that Indigenous people are alive today in what we now call Connecticut. We stand on the land of their ancestors. Historically, West Haven's seaside and rivers with abundant food sources made this an ideal summering place. We have a map of present-day reservations that you might check out in the lobby so that we understand our neighbors and each other better. Natasha Gambrell is from the Eastern Pequot tribe. She's a tribal counselor and a poet, and she will open today with her work.
Okwe, Wandukisuk, Natatawis, Shadow Dancer. Hello, my name is Natasha Gambrell, but my native name is Shadow Dancer. I'm going to read a poem about my tribe. So it's called They Were Celebrating. On October 12, 2005, the United States government said we ceased to exist, gone, kaput, a figment of your imagination. Another native tribe thought to be wiped from the history books, and this is our story. They were celebrating while my heart was cold. It was like a blizzard had swept my entire body. They were celebrating that day the Creator didn't embrace us with his warmth, but instead left us frozen, feeling his bitter teardrops. They were celebrating while I sat there, twisting and turning, mesmerized by the idea of federal recognition. They were celebrating while the elders were sick and hopeless, and the youth were uninspired and suffering ambition. They were celebrating while there was little concern in the air. See, we knew we were a tribe, and we had existed since the beginning of time. They were celebrating while we played honor songs to mourn the loss of our fallen warriors. They were celebrating while that drum pounded like a bold fist. It's pounded like a bold fist, fighting its way into my ears like the struggle of my people. They were celebrating while I passed that red house with the red mailbox. My nerves were already tied in knots in the road, and all of its cracky imperfections did little to grant forgiveness. They were celebrating while I could see the fire lit and members of our tribe huddled around its burning flame. They were celebrating while we had hoped the past frustrations and attempts at recognition would be wiped clean, a new dawn for my people. They were celebrating while that fax came down and they destroyed us with a single mark of a pen. They were celebrating while history had repeated itself and the government had wiped out another powerful nation. They were celebrating while I looked at my people everywhere in tears, sad that their day of recognition passed by with a colorblind eye. They were celebrating while after all these years nothing had changed. The white man continues to speak with a forked tongue. They were celebrating October 12, 2005, Columbus Day, while we were left dead on Lantern Hill. They were celebrating when the then Attorney General Richard Blumenthal stated this was the greatest day in Connecticut state history. Those words burned like salt in a wound. They were celebrating that day I learned to hate. But one day we will celebrate. Our time will come to receive our federal recognition and help deliver our official identity. A wounded, resilient, proud people. Aho. Thank you.
So, I think this is when we're going to go ahead and start our panel. Come on up. However you get here is fine. Thank you for such a beautiful piece.
Oh, there's mic. Are there mics here? Yes. Okay. Okay, good. Because thank you, Natasha, for that. I'm Ife-Michelle Gardin, founder of Elm City LIT Fest, celebration of literature, literary arts, and literary artists of the African diaspora, and big supporter of ArtsWestCT and these artists here. And I'm so happy to be here. I would like to start actually with asking each one of you for a selection in the theme of the day that art is not a luxury. Sorry, lots of words. And Frederick, we'll start on that end with you.
Poetry, art is not a luxury. You know, we're just chosen, right, as individuals on this planet, right? We're born into this certain type of social standard and conditioning and so forth, and through all that, we're trying to like establish our identities day in and day out, and trying to make sure that they fit into the social establishment. And then we wake up one day and we realize that, you know, our identities don't fit, like our spiritual identities, right? And so for myself, you know, part of my spiritual identity is poetry. And, you know, when I realized that and I embraced that, I was just like, oh, whoa, there's a certain responsibility that comes with it, right? Because when I'm writing, I'm quite sure other folks here on the panel can attest as well too, and we're receiving these messages, you know, and like your poem, right? And it's just like, oh wow, you want me to say that? Like, oh, okay. And then if we don't, right? If I don't, then it weighs on me. It weighs on my spirit, like you know, like I failed a mission or something like that, right? And then it's passed on to somebody else who fulfills the mission, and I go, oh man, I should have just did that. And so it's not a luxury, right? It's just part of me, right? And there's a huge responsibility in that, because like artists like, you know, Audre Lorde and so forth, and Langston Hughes and so many others that have paved the way in showing us that, you know, there's things out here that need to be said in our society, things that we need to address that are just being sugar-coated and glazed over. And so for me, it's a way of breathing. It's a way of giving homage to my ancestors as well too. It's a way of knowing that, wow, this is part of why I'm on this planet, right? And it's a way of connecting as well. And so sometimes it's happy, smiley faces and great good times, because artistry does that for us, you know, pulls us together. But other times it's just like, okay, I'm going probably receive a little bit of, kickback for this, or a little bit of flack for this and so forth. But at the end of the day, between me and my maker and the gift that has been bestowed upon me from her, it's just like, this is what it is, and so I stand by that. So, yeah.
I'll clap. I just came from a funeral this morning, right? And it's an uncle, right, who had cancer for 19 years and has been married for 38. He came to the US as an adult, came from El Salvador, which is where I was born. And when he came, it was with the understanding that he was coming here for a better life. And yet, when you look back at it, here he was in El Salvador, a country that, albeit, was going through what would be a disastrous civil war that would take upwards of 100,000 lives. He figured that, like many other immigrants, like my father had done, like my mother had done, that coming here to the US would pay dividends. And it did for his family. It did for his kids. And yet here he was, this successful electrician with a business in El Salvador, making decent money, and then came to the US to work not as an electrician, but to work on slot machines and to work on them for quite a long time, and then only to find himself getting sick. There's a story there that needs to be told, that needs to be remembered. That's not necessarily just his story, it's an immigrant story. It's a story that too often isn't heard. There's a narrative there that isn't heard. There's an alternative narrative that we often hear, whether it be on social media, whether it be on some network, whether it be through some talking head. So when I hear the phrase, art, poetry, whether it's not a luxury, yes, it's not a luxury. Not if we want to be fair to ourselves, to our people, to our histories. And if we want to recognize that when we ignore stories like that, when we stop telling stories like that, when we don't put them into art form, we do ourselves a disfavor. And we do others who are painting an alternative narrative the favor of painting an alternative narrative that is unfair and often cruel. So today's theme, I think, is appropriate for the times. I think it gives us so much to look forward to, Antoinette, because I know that you write so much thematically along the lines of Audre Lorde and so much of what she has stood for, and I thank you.
Poetry for me, and I can speak personally and then just talk about society as well, has been both a vehicle for, a vehicle for expressing the conflicts that I've experienced, both within myself and in relationship to society, and also as a way of transcending the political. And it's the only way that I know how to do that. It's how I get to make sense of the world, how I get to make sense of the things that have happened in my life that I can't intellectually process. And I think that listening to a poem is so much more powerful, as we just experienced, than reading an article about something. And it can be also for young people. I know as an educator, if I can share a piece of art or a performance piece
or a poem with my students, that it will reach students differently than lecturing to them, or having them read some watered down version of history. And rather than doing that, I try to find voices. I try to share voices with them and images with them that will stick with them long beyond I get, the time that we have together. So I see poetry in my life and in the world as a way to speak to those complicated issues, and really just reach people who may not be reached in other ways.
I think for me, poetry isn't a luxury, but it's a form of survival. For a long time, the state of Connecticut has tried to leave my people, indigenous people, voiceless. So for me, I write because I don't have another choice. I write to show the youth the way and to keep the elder stories alive. So for me, it's just a way of life. I have to do this. Sometimes growing up, my mother always told me, the Creator doesn't always give you a choice. And the Creator didn't give me a choice. He put me on this path for a reason, to keep our stories alive.
Yeah, actually, I could just say what they said. For me, as some of you have mentioned, that it's a part of you, poetry, and it's not something that you can take on and off, but it is just who you are. It's part of your identity. And living in one's identity and one's true self is not a luxury. It definitely is a necessity. And I also think having a voice is not a luxury. It should not be that certain people have an amplification because of their privilege or status or whatever, but that we should all have an opportunity to give voice to our concerns. Also, I think poetry is a way to figure things out. Right? Lots of times we make snap judgments or knee-jerk decisions about things because in the moment they sound this way or that. But when we actually put pen to paper and we have to write it out and we have to choose words and choose form, it's through that process that we really discover. And when we discover, then we are able to, it's like showing your work when you're doing the math problems. I don't know if they do that anymore because I know there have been several new maths since I've been in school. But it's like showing your work, to other people. And oftentimes they will see themselves in your work. And then they find these commonalities and it's like, oh, yeah, I feel that way too. Or, oh, that's similar to my experience. And then I think we demystify, the differences between each other, and we find those commonalities. And we have an opportunity to start talking to each other. Because we are not talking about, the big issues that are floating around, but we're talking about them crystallized into this one poem. And it gives us an opportunity to focus and then to go from that poem into something bigger and to something more universal. And like I said before, the way things are going in our country right now, where people are so divided, I think poetry can be that bridge that can get us to leave our little silos and travel over to someone else's world and participate.
Thank you all. For me, I remember when I was in school, the first poet that I remember, Black poet that I remembered, that was like, oh my God, her story is like me, is Gwendolyn Brooks. We Be Cool. And so once, and that was like, I had to find all her work. And then reading it and understanding, like she wrote about us, you know, I was in New Haven and she was in Chicago. She was writing about neighborhood, but it was still a neighborhood. So I'd like you all to answer. What was the if you can remember, your first poem that sparked your, oh, that's it, that's for me, and maybe name a couple of your favorite poets since then.
Thank you. That's a great question. I do remember the first poem and even the second poem. It was, I had to be somewhere between 6 and 7, so I was a new reader. And my grandmother was always sending me books, and I think, you know, she and my mother back in those days had no idea what like age-appropriate literature was. So I would just get all of these big, heavy, thick books, and I got an anthology of African-American poetry. It might have even been the Dudley Randall, yeah. And so my little 6 and 7-year-old self came across Langston Hughes's Dream poem, and I didn't really know what poetry was, but I knew that I loved that little poem. And I knew that I needed to get some dreams, right? You know, and I wasn't really sure how I was gonna, you know, get some dreams, you know, but I felt like this individual, this poet, was giving me a little piece of wisdom. And that was the beginning of it. And then it was the Bean Eaters. Yeah, that was the second poem. And oh my gosh, it's so funny because I was just a little pumpkin. I had no idea what the poem meant. So in my little 6.5, 7-year-old mind, I thought it meant that if you were going to be a poet, you had to eat beans and be poor. And I committed to my little, you know, 6.5, 7-year-old self that that's exactly what I was going to do because I wanted to write poems. And so, you know, now all of these years later, going back and looking at the Bean Eaters, it tickles me all the time to think that that's what I got out of it at 7. But I guess it goes to show that even if in that moment you don't capture the poet's intention, you capture the spirit of the poem and the spirit of the poet, and it takes you to another place, and it still makes you aspirational.
I think the first poem that I can actually like remember and having to memorize was County Cullen. It was Riding Through Old Baltimore. I went to Catholic school growing up, so every summer my mom would make me memorize different poems, and that was the one that kind of stuck with me, and that's the one that got me into poetry. As I got older, I got more into Paul Laurence Dunbar. The poem We Wear the Mask was something that I generally just really related to, having to wear several masks, going to Catholic school, having to hide that indigenous side of myself while I was at school. And then I think as I got older, a more contemporary poet that I really fell in love with is Jasmine Mans. She's on the younger end, but just her work was just phenomenal to me, and it just made me want to write.
That's actually the very first poem that I remember reading also, is the same poem by County Cullen, and it continues to stick with me through the years, and I teach it now, which is pretty cool to be able to share that with students. You know, I've loved Langston Hughes in high school, and recently have been reading a lot of Natalie Diaz, Eugenia Lee, Suji Kwok Kim is one of my favorites. She writes an entire collection of poetry that's based around the division between South and North Korea, and is able to write personal poetry that's also political in a way that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think she won or was nominated for every single award that exists, and then she just sort of disappeared into academia and hasn't written anything since, but that book I've probably read 12 times. DMZ Colony also is really interesting by Don Mi Choi, and I believe she won the National Book Award. or at least was nominated for it. So those are a couple of my favorites, and I could go on and on about my favorite poets, but I will stop.
Yeah, so continuing with the theme of Langston Hughes, I tell you, how can you not love him? And so someone like me who, grew up around rap, right? The roots of rap. I'm not as old as Frederick, but but I've been around long enough to remember just sitting out in New London on the porch and listening to WBLS and listening to all these beautiful rhythms coming in, especially on foggy nights when that antenna was getting all those signals, and then I discovered Langston Hughes, and I thought, my goodness, there's some rhythms there, there's a beat there that is beautiful, but then beyond that, the themes, so much of what I had read didn't mention any kinds of themes, right? And even the ones that, we talk about being marginalized, those that are obvious, but even the ones about mother to son, right? I was always a mama's boy. I loved my mommy. I mentioned before how my parents came here. My mom and dad, they actually, they moved to New London, Connecticut from El Salvador. They couldn't choose a colder place, I tell you. And I'm not bitter, I'm just bitter cold. And I still remember to this day when she said to me, we're leaving you and your sister. And man, one of the saddest days of my life. I didn't see her for years after that. So, when I read Langston Hughes and when I discovered him, I was like, wow, this is so much about so many of the lives that I know, so many of the mothers that I know, and with so many of the rhythms that I know, so many of the beats. I just, from day one, just remember that being such a turn for me in terms of poetry, the way that it could be defined, and the way that I could write poetry. I thought, wow, maybe I can try some of this.
I think I really fell in love with poetry with Dr. Seuss, right? Elementary school, because it was a new way of reading, right? But for me, really, the first poets, as Jose was alluding to, was hip hop. Rakim. I mean, he's one of the truest poets out there. And for myself, growing up in a predominantly all-white school, all-white neighborhood, and so on and so forth, there wasn't a lot of reflection of myself or people like me within the narrative, right? And so here came these guys, here came Big Daddy Kane, here came Rakim, and so forth, and just took poetry to a whole other level. And was like, wow, I really love this, And then, of course, later on, I didn't get into poetry till later, but poems that stick out for me, of course, Langston Hughes' Theme for English B was a poem I studied later on in school. And then, Gwendolyn Brooks, The Mother, like if you want to talk about a poet not being a luxury, I mean, this is a poem about abortion, right? And it's just raw, absolutely raw, and it was just like, oh, okay. And so from there, being able to actually read these artists or listen to these artists and just really bring the rawness, like Big Daddy Kane's album, raw, right? His song was called Raw, and I was like, well, if I'm gonna do this, right? I'm gonna, I enjoy doing this. I mean, I can't stay in the Dr. Seuss bubble, forever. Like hip hop didn't stay in that Dr. Seuss bubble. I had to really be able to actually put it on the line, right? Because these poets put it on the line, for us, and hopefully, as we put it on the line and so forth, that other people are inspired to put it on the line as well, and that's how we start to, develop change in our society. Yeah.
Wow, thank you for that. And it's interesting because that leads into my next question about rhythm and form and music. Like when you're creating, is there music that you listen to, a rhythm in your head, some inspiration you get from that? We come back again this way.
Back to me. Yeah, I listen to jazz while I read and write and so forth. My brother's a jazz artist, and he really got me into jazz. And then really studying the jazz era, the bebop era, specifically, you know, with Miles Davis and Coltrane, and so forth. And those guys were just the coolest, man. Like, it's just, I was like, oh, if I could be born in an era, that would be my era. Because the language, the culture, the style, the dress, the musicality, all of it was just, you know, stellar. And I get musicality within my writing from hip hop and so on and so forth, and you know, artists. I mean, I listen to Kanye West. Yeah, I do. Right. I'm just gonna say it. Right. He's a genius, hands down. Professionally, a genius. Right. I don't know the man personally, but professionally, you know, he's a genius. And if you want to talk about art not being a luxury, I mean, I really, if we could just look at his life as we know on the public screen and so forth, it's not a luxury for him, you know. Matter of fact, there's an essay by Heba Nagatu, it's called Kanye West, The Politics of Black Self-Love, and she argues that he's being vain, not just to be vain, but it's a political act of black self-love that stems from Audre Lorde. And you said a survival, Audre Lorde calls it a survival mantra, like artistry is the survival mantra. And so I listen to artists who I feel are evoking that survival mantra within myself. So, yeah, that's it. Like you're talking too much.
No, you weren't talking too much. No. So, trust me, you weren't. So, I was fortunate in that I grew up in a family where my dad would always play these eclectic albums, and by that I really mean all over the place. I mean, he would play, for example, Eddie Dutchin piano. He would Tijuana brass. You know, anytime those TV shows, game shows would come on, I'd say, hey, I know that sound, right? And of course, you know, Latin, you know, you name it, it was all there. And so I always loved listening to all sorts of beats. But what I found is that when it came time to creating, it wasn't so much the lyrics that I listened to, but it was the beats. And quite often what I do is when I have, you know, what we sometimes call writer's block, right, is try to listen to beat A and try to start that way. So rather than, you know, sometimes writers will find all sorts of ways to start a poem. You know, and sometimes, for example, I'll give my students a prompt and say, okay, begin with this line, or we begin with a line from this poem, whatever. What I try to do is try to begin with beats from certain, whatever it might be, you know, whether it be, you know, something a little jazzy, lo-fi is what I've been into lately. So I've been listening to that quite a bit because I find that, you know, if the lyrics are there, then I'll get too close to the lyrics, and I don't want to listen to lyrics. I don't want those lyrics to be part of what I'm writing. I want that rhythm to be part of what I'm writing.
I do not listen to music while I'm writing. I love quiet. I love silence. I find it very inspiring, probably because I don't get much of it in my life. As a middle school teacher and a mother of 3, there's constantly background noise. So when I'm writing, I actually mostly write very early in the morning because it's the only time that it's quiet. Sometimes my dog just sits there barking at me and wants me to pay attention to him, but I love quiet. In thinking about music that just inspires my creative process, I actually was in Brooklyn last night at the Brooklyn Opera House to see a version of Trojan Women that was put on by a Korean theater company, Korean opera company, that was sold out in Seoul, it was sold out in London, and it was in Brooklyn for 2 nights. And I was like, I have to see this. And it was so incredibly intense. I didn't know very much about the production, and it was just grief. the entire production is grief, and to see Korean women they actually were wearing mourning gowns. There's a very particular article of clothing that Korean women wear to funerals, and it's all white. And so they were all dressed in white, and the way that Korean culture influenced this particular version of the opera was to use traditional Korean rhythms. So in traditional music, really just colored the entire production and the way that the opera was sung, and it was so emotional. I found myself actually wanting to withdraw a little bit. It was so intense. But having experiences like that, going to theater or listening to music, just to keep myself rooted in different forms of art too, was really important to me. But when it comes to writing, I just kind of prefer quiet.
I think for me, I like to listen to powwow music or traditional powwow music, but it's not so much what I'm listening to. For me, it's where I write. I feel like I'm the most creative when I'm on my reservation. There's just a sense of peace up there, and a sense that I'm walking on the same land that my ancestors walked on, and just having that feeling of them holding me up while I'm writing, or them encouraging me to write, or giving the voiceless a voice. So for me, it's where, not so much of what I listen to.
Wow, I'm actually taking notes from the things that they say. I'll be looking up all of this stuff. When it comes to musicality and my poetry, I often look to form. I love both traditional and modern form. And when I sit down to write a poem, I'll have an idea of what the poem is going to be about. I never know an outcome because I'm writing toward discovery. But if I know that it's going to be a lamentation or something sad, I tend to choose a form that has a lot of repetition in it. And it'll take its repetition, it'll take its rhythm from that repetition. I'll choose a villanelle, I'll choose a duplex, something where this or even a ghazal, where the repetition almost becomes a whine, or it becomes more emphatic as time goes on, where you feel like you're just being nagged by it. And so if I want to just do, I guess, a big 1-2 punch, I'll go to a haiku, because I know that it's got to be compressed. I only have a certain number of syllables, and so every word has to have a real strong thud to it, or even just a wisp of meditative kind of sound. The other thing I do is I will listen to a song on repeat if for some reason I just like the sound of it, or I like the way it's making me move, because oftentimes when we hear music, we can't help it, but we start to move. I actually saw on Instagram the other day that scientists have found that rats actually move to music too. So I guess music is very powerful. That's an aside. But if I'm wanting, if I'm feeling that tone or that vibration, I'll just play that song on repeat while I'm writing. And then I will do the Joan thing, which is go into complete silence and then revise the poem so it finds its own resting place.
Okay, now we're opening up to the audience. I believe everybody got a card when they came in to write a question down as we're having a conversation. I'm coming down, get my exercise in. Anybody got a question? Please. Poets in the audience, anybody? Somebody got a question? Thank you.
Hi everyone. Ooh, that's loud. Thank you for all of the gems and all of the personal experiences that you all shared. One of the things that you said, Antoinette, towards the end was about picking your form. And I wanted to ask to anyone who had a response to it, for someone or for anyone who strategically sticks to free form writing but wanted to explore different forms, what would be a go-to? What would be something that not based on ease but based on understanding would be a go-to for for students who might be intimidated by too much structure but wants to learn?
He's going to answer because I know he's been doing some good stuff lately with form.
I mean, I really just took a look at some forms that I was intimidated by, right? Like a sonnet, right? Because you hear the word sonnet and you're just like, oh my God, like what is that? Shakespeare. I can't write like Shakespeare. And one day I just sat down and was like, well, what am I afraid of? Like, and there's different sonnets, of course. And so I looked up sonnets and I looked for a particular poem that I was drawn to, right, that I could, really resonate with, and I just started emulating, right, with the rhyme scheme, the meter, and so forth, and it takes a while, right, because I don't know how many drafts I wrote a particular poem, but then like anything else, any other skill, like once you get it, it's just like, okay, I got that, right? Another favorite of mine is a pantome, which you repeat lines, right? And so that throughout the poem, it's challenging because you have to use the same lines over and over again, right? But it has to not only make sense, right, but then not run the risk of sounding like too repetitious, right? So a pantome is really fun. And then this, the one I wrote, what's the one where you write the poem and then you write it in reverse? It's slipping my mind right now. Oh gosh, it will come back to me. But anyway, you can Google it. Yeah, a palindrome. Yes, thank you. Palindrome is when you write the poem, word for word, line for line, and then like the first stanza, and then you have to reverse it, right? And so it really challenges you to tell a story like forward and literally in reverse, right? And still make sense and convey a message. So just, I would say, start with the one that you're most intimidated by, and once you knock that giant out, then, you a G.
I can talk about, because I recently have been going through a period of not writing, which is very painful as a poet when you feel like you can't write. And I started, I'm obsessed with Whitney Houston, and has a new, like there's a docudrama coming out about her, and I'm like counting down the days until that comes out. But anyway, that's an aside. I started writing erasure poems of Whitney Houston songs, and found it really fun and strange, and what emerged from those songs are things that I never would have imagined emerging from them. So then once I had a set of those, I started doing it with other women's songs, Amy Winehouse, Ani DeFranco. So that's currently what I'm doing, and I think erasure for people who struggle with form is less intimidating because you're working with text that's already there, and you can always create something with an erasure. I'm actually teaching a class too on epistolary writing, which for younger people also can be a very powerful tool as a poem. Writing letters to a body part, writing letters to someone who has died, writing letters to your favorite song. I mean, you can write epistolary poems to very unexpected objects. So those are the two that I would recommend. I struggle with form a lot. The Pantome, I've written one successfully. it feels, I've also never taken a formal class in poetry, so that might have something to do with it. I'm like, I'm not like a real poet, I guess. I don't have formal training. But the erasure, the epistolary poem are very user-friendly forms.
I wanted to kind of add to that. Whenever anyone starts to talk about form, I always have to kind of smile and kind of tell on myself, because a lot of people know me as a formalist, but when I began, I guess, writing seriously, I always wrote in free verse. And so when I did my MFA program, I was going through a divorce. I had 3 kids at home, and the chair of our program said, well, Antoinette, I think it's time for you to start experimenting with form. And my words to her exactly were, Louise, I want to write free verse. I just want to be free. And she tried to explain to me that sometimes when you're dealing with subject matter that is really big and broad and amorphous, you need a container. She was writing elegies to her mother who had passed away, and or who was in the process of passing away. And she said that the only way she could write was to find a form. And then when I started writing my second book, which is about love, love is one of those, big topics, I realized I needed form. And that's when I started looking for form. And I've been writing almost exclusively in form ever since. And even when I do write in free verse, I'm creating a form specifically for that poem. I would say start with the villanelle. It's really easy in the sense that if you just sit and write 2 really good lines, then you can just build from there, and the core of your poem stays pretty strong. I often teach my students the bop, which is a modern form by a Black poet, in which the first stanza of the poem states a problem, and then in between there are lines from a song. And so then, you state the problem, and then you add those 2 lines from the song, and then you go to the next one. And if there is a resolution, you write the resolution. If there's no resolution to the problem, then you state that there's no resolution. And that's really cool, because it gives you some structure, but it still allows you to be free in those individual stanzas. I've been writing a lot in the unit form, which is another modern form that was created by a Black poet. And it's a prose poem that works with sentences. And what I found about that is I don't usually think that way. So I have the luxury of sitting and working on one sentence at a time until it's just, perfection in my mind. And then I go to the next sentence. And I think you end up doing that like 12 times with one repetition, so you get a 1 freebie. And that works really, really well. And another form that I enjoy, another modern form by a Black poet, is the duplex, in which you write a line, and then the line that follows it is the exact same line, except you put a spin on it. So what ends up happening is you're digging into that line and that idea and coming out of it in a new way, and then going into a new line and coming out of it in a new way. And it's just really a cool form to work with. I am now working on a sestina, and if anyone knows what a sestina is, it's really torture. And so you've got, you've got 6 words that have to remain the end lines, and you keep doing this, and it's like 6 or 7 stanzas, and I tried it and tried it and tried it, and I could never write a decent one. And then someone challenged me to try it again, and I thought, well, maybe now that I'm a big poet, I can do it, because I was a baby poet when I started trying to, and it's actually working. I'm like halfway in, and I can see, the end. So I say that to say that if a form doesn't work for you immediately, then, leave it, try another form, and then come back to it after you have gotten a lot more confidence. I'm sorry, that's my long answer.
That was fabulous. Oh.
So just real quick about Sestina, because I wrote one on my grandmother. So what I was thinking was maybe the content, right? Like, because that's what made me finish the poem. Like, it's frustrating because you got to use all 6 words in the last stanza. But wanting to tell her story of coming from Georgia up here, and because she was a twin, and her twin sister died when she was like 2 years old. And when my grandmother was about to transcend, she was about 102 years old, she kept asking for Mary. So her name is Martha, and she kept asking for Mary all the time. And so it was that I was like, no, I'm going to finish this and tell their story. So maybe sometimes when the form, like you said, is frustrating, if it's the content, maybe be able to push you through it and so forth. So yeah, they're torturous.
Thank you all. Okay, I have another question. Who do you most want your poetry to reach? Is there any specific person? And would you rather your poetry comfort an audience within your community or challenge an audience outside of it?
I just spoke, so somebody.
Yeah, I'm glad it's down there. Y'all start.
Mike's in front of Jose.
So I really had to think hard about this type of question in my first collection, because I had this one poem about my dad, right? So my dad was an alcoholic, right? And when I say he was an alcoholic, he struggled and was a good dad, but there were times, for example, when he would go to parent-teacher conferences, and the teachers could tell, right? And so I wrote about this in part to help me, right, cope with this, to kind of get some kind of self-reflection along the way, and really for some healing. And then when I put together my collection, I really thought hard, should I include this? Should I include this poem? Because, our families, we don't like to tell the world anything, right? I mean, I was brought up, this is our business, you don't go around telling anybody's business, that sort of thing. And it was ringing in my head, and I could picture family members giving me dirty looks before the poem could even be released. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, who is going to be reading this poem, right? And then I thought about addiction, and I thought about all forms of addiction and all the people who have been affected in some way or other by addiction. And then I thought, if I include it, and if there's a chance of this young person, whether that be someone in high school, whether it be someone in middle school, whether it be someone in college, or even after, but really those folks who are struggling with that and whose world they think is ending, if they can read this poem and then get a little bit of inspiration out of it, and then realize that it's not the end of the world, and that sometimes this is a problem that affects not just one person, but affects so many of us, then maybe I should include it. And so I've taken that approach time and time again, is to think, okay, who's really, in some cases, yes, someone might be hurt by this, but who's going to benefit from it? right? And thinking of it that way, I think gave me freedom to be more honest, and it also, I think, gave me eventually more satisfaction to know that perhaps there is someone out there who felt somewhat, you know, on the way to healing because of what I've written.
So I've written 3 books, and they're all very difficult books about topics that my family did not want me to write about. 2 of them are about the untimely deaths of 2 family members, both to suicide within 2 months of one another. And the other is about my own recovery journey through a 12-step fellowship. And when I wrote both of the books, or the poems in both of the books, I actually never thought that they would be published. And so that actually became, I think, an avenue toward powerful poetry, to manuscripts that people actually did want to read, because I wrote these poems thinking, oh, I'm just gonna write whatever I want because nobody's ever gonna read this stuff anyway. And what I've learned in the last few years having books published is that those are the poems that people actually need to read. Those are the ones that you think are too much, are the poems that actually need to exist in the world. So I try to keep that in mind when I'm writing now, and I've absolutely upset people. My intention was never to upset or isolate people, but it's sort of inevitable, I think, and you have to make a lot of decisions about you know, what is important to you as an artist, as a writer, and as a human being. And for me, upsetting people for whatever reason is less important to me than it is to tell the truth. Because I feel like as a human being and as an artist, what else do I have? If I can't tell the truth in my writing, what am I even doing? What's even the point? So the fallout from writing the truth and my truth, you know, in a way that other people may not want to hear, but maybe there are people who do need to hear it, has been very empowering for me as an artist, and has also helped me find my community. I found out in writing a couple of the books, especially about suicide, loss to suicide, is that every American person that I have met either has lost someone to suicide or has been suicidal and survived their own attempt or decided to stay in spite of feeling that way. Every single person that I have met. So I no longer apologize for writing what I write, because I find that the benefit far outweighs any, you know, few people that didn't like it and like blocked me on Facebook or whatever. Like, who cares, you know?
I think for me, the reason I write, or the people, the audience that I want to hear, is not just Indigenous people, it's everybody. Just getting our stories out there and making them be told. I can just remember, like the poem that I read in the beginning, I can remember I was 13 years old when the United States government said my people ceased to exist. I was 13 when I faced a genocide for the first time. I write so that people know that story and that it doesn't happen to others, because history repeats itself. And my mom always said, it's us today and it's you tomorrow. So if they can single-handedly try to destroy us today, they'll come after you tomorrow.
I kind of like Joan didn't think, you know, maybe certain poems would be out there in the world. What I tried to say to myself, even as I was writing my first collection, was that write the truest poem, but you don't have to show it to anybody. So it's kind of what I told myself, but I knew it was going to be in the book. I think it was just my way of relieving myself of the concern at the time of writing. I don't think as much about audience as I do about intention. My first book is about coming of age through divorce, and you know, it's not something that is unkind to my ex or anything. It's about me. It's about how I came back to myself and came through to myself. And when it went out there in the world and I started getting emails saying your book helped me, then I knew that it had found its audience. I trust that my books will find the audience that they need to find. And I always want to make sure that if I'm writing about a particular subject, that my intention is pure. You know, for a while, I wasn't sure how to approach race because I didn't want to write something that was didactic or finger-wagging or anything. And I asked Claudia Rankin, I was like, you know, how do you get away from that? And she said, find your own culpability in it. And I was like, wow. So that changed how I looked at things. And instead of it being me pointing outward, it was me pointing inward. You know, what am I seeing? How am I feeling? And how am I either helpful or not helpful in this particular situation? So for me, it's about intention. You know, as long as I'm right with why I'm doing it and how I'm doing it, I believe that the poems will find their audience, whether it be inside of my community or outside of my community.
Well, thank you all for those inspiring answers. Oh, there's one more. Sorry. Coming right over to you. Oh, and you too. Them and then you.
Just wondering how you folks feel about, say, words as music. That's kind of my first love, music, but anyway. And the sound, I mean, how much sense do the words have to make, actually? Maybe they find their own sense, you know. You get the sounds going, you know, whatever it is, you know, whether it's scat or hickory-dickory-dock or whatever, you know, like, I don't know, this is hard to put, actually. And maybe just the words coming, you know, just dictating themselves, no thought, and you know, maybe the form chooses you. You don't go, I'm gonna write a haiku or anything, you just see what happens as you're kind of inspired over what, anything, you know, flower, music, being still. I think the form finds itself myself, but like, I don't know, any responses or whatever to that, so, from any.
I think oftentimes a poem will tell you what it wants to be. I have often likened my poems to stubborn, tired, 2-year-old toddlers that are kicking around and insisting upon their own way. And sometimes I have to yield to them and let them be who they want to be. And sometimes they kick the form off of themselves. Sometimes they become about something I didn't even know I was going to write about. And you're very right, and sometimes the poem forms itself.
Okay, we really have to get trying to keep with time, but we have one more here, and then we have to get to the workshops, and Eleanor will explain that after this last question.
All right, I just have one question for Antoinette. You mentioned about intention earlier, so my question would be, while reading a poem, do you try to understand the poem by analyzing the text itself, or also trying to understand the intention of the poet? Because the reason why I asked you, because while I was studying literature, you know, my professor would often tell me, not to commit an intentional fallacy. And it's just hard not to commit into intentional fallacy while trying to understand poems in general. So I guess that's my question, Do you just analyze the text itself, or also trying to analyze the intentions of the poet too?
That's an amazing question. When I'm talking about intention, I'm talking about searching myself as the writer for my own intention to make sure that I'm not going to the page to be unkind or to indict someone or to call out someone. Although I did once own a t-shirt that said, "I'm a writer, be careful what you say to me, it might end up in a poem." I want to make sure that I'm not like that. But when I take off my poet's hat and I become the reader or the critic or the consumer of that particular poem, I take the poem for what it is on the page. My first poetry mentor, David Kluhl, told me, "Antoinette, you write for the careful reader." So I try to be the careful reader when I read someone's work on the page. I read it, I listen to the sounds, I listen to the way they've broken the lines, the way they've broken the stanzas, the sections, and I try to honor how they've written the poem, thinking that they have guided me through this poem for a particular reason. And if there's something I don't understand, like a word, or even if I think I understand the word, I might look it up because it might have other meanings that have been lost to time. No, I don't interrogate the poet's intention. I just live in the poem, try to crawl into the poem as much as possible. But for me, intention is important as a writer to make sure that I am adhering to my own values and maintain integrity.
I think first and foremost, get out of academia with it, right? Because academia is, it's like a kissing cousin, right? Because there's the critical aspect, right, of criticism and so forth, and how to approach an artist, a poet's work, and what do they mean, and what's their intention, and here's these theories, and we analyze the text and our interpretations and so forth, which serves its purpose. I mean, I teach it, but leave it at the door, right? Because if the critical approach of the poem has our minds like totally just topsy-turvy and so forth, and we can't seem to get our way through to the core of the poem and so forth, then we really have to question purpose, right? And so is the poem actually resonating here first? Because once it resonates here, it will work its way up here, right? And then if we have the tools of theories and so forth and academic tools, we can use those tools, right, to have a better intellectual discovery, right? But that emotional discovery is here first. And so as far as intent goes, one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, what is our intent as the reader of the poem, right? Because what an artist might put on the paper may not be that interpretation, right? There's multitudes of interpretations. So what is our intent? What are we looking for in this poem and so forth? Because we get upset when we don't see it. Well, I didn't see that on the page, and I didn't know you meant that. Well, that's because it's for you. You found it. That's the discovery. So just, when you heard, I could tell by your response that, some sort of struggle with what your professor was coming with their pedagogy or so on and so forth, and what you are feeling or trying to discover within the poem itself, right? Leave the professor at the door, man. The grades is gonna disappear and go away and so forth. It's not real, right? And I am a professor, so it's, and just stay here and stay within the realm.
Thank you all. This is a fantastic segue for this stimulating, nourishing conversation to continue with stretching and moving and finding ways to contribute and offer more of our thoughts back. As we've seen by the gentleman's comment earlier, it might make you think of your own practice or questions, or go to Google something and want to bring that to this conversation. So that's what this next section is about, and I want to acknowledge with gratitude Ife's expert facilitation and thank her for being here today. Isn't she amazing? So we have some suggested breakout sessions and then some open space for anything else people want to talk about. You might have seen some colorful tablecloths, so we have some coding here at the orange table with truth telling. We'll see if people can talk about whatever they want to talk about, but at the orange table with the topic of truth telling, you can find Frederick-Douglass and Jose Gonzalez for further discussion. At the purple table with Ife, power and agency will be the starting point. At the pink table, Natasha Gambrell will be there for naming and acknowledgement, how poetry is a way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. And Antoinette will be at the green table with beauty and form, so more of that can continue. At the turquoise table, I have a calendar. We'd love you to tell us if there's anything that you're working on poetry-wise that's coming up that you'd like Antoinette to get out in a newsletter, or collaborate in any way. We'll just be taking a lot of notes. So this is your time, and enjoy the refreshments, Rhythm Roasting and Vicky Longo for the refreshments today. So we have the building till 5 o'clock, so make of it what you will. Thank you so much.